What's going on there, YouTube? Welcome back to another comic book video. Okay, so we're going to do a full story video. A full story video is when I sit down and take a bunch of videos that tell one overarching story and combine them together into one big video. Now, today's full story video is going to be about Captain America: Streets of Poison. You see, in the early mid 1990s, you had Marvel give us this storyline where Steve Rogers gets hooked on a new drug called ice. But on top of that, he's also trying to stop a drug war from breaking out in Manhattan. It was a 7-part storyline that took place in the early 1990s. I do hope you enjoy today's full story video. Okay, so I feel like we should go ahead and get back into our coverage over Captain America. It has been a long time since we have sat down and covered any stories involving Steve Rogers. And so I had decided to go ahead and cover Streets of Poison. Now, this was a 7-part storyline where you have Steve Rogers fighting against a bunch of different characters. The Kingpin, the Red Skull, Bullseye, Crossbones, Daredevil, Black Widow, Diamondback. Like, this whole storyline is really big for Steve Rogers. It's his war on drugs. But here comes the big catch though. You see, for Steve Rogers, the dude is also hooked on drugs in his storyline as well. So yeah, he's trying to get rid of drugs, but the entire time he's on drugs, fighting against all these different characters as well. It is one heck of a storyline. Now, this is a long storyline, so I had decided to go ahead and make 2 videos for this storyline. Don't worry, we should get both videos out in 1 week, or really 2 days most likely. But either way, here is Captain America: Streets of Poison. And so getting into today's storyline, we do pick up with Steve Rogers just riding his sky cycle. Now for Steve Rogers, while doing that, he does spot somebody on top of a rooftop. And that would be a character known as, well, good old Boomslag. Now, Boomslag is part of the Serpent Society. That is really more of a organization full of mercenaries. Now, each person who's part of that group, their name is based off a snake-themed name. So like Diamondback or Boomslag. Either way, for Steve Rogers, he realized that Boomslag is on top of a rooftop watching someone in their apartment. And that would be a character known as Diamondback. Now, for Diamondback, she was part of the Serpent Society as well as a mercenary. Now, she first appeared in Captain America issue number 310. But either way, she was a mercenary early on, but by this point in Marvel's timeline, she was a good guy. Matter of fact, you had Marvel use her as a possible new love interest for Steve Rogers. But either way, we do see that Boomslag is apparently watching her. Now, you have Steve Rogers go down there and begin to chase him down. But unfortunately, while trying to chase down Boomslag, he goes down an alleyway. But before Steve is able to arrive, he hears a bunch of gunshots. And so by the time Steve Rogers got there, well, unfortunately, he finds Boomslag on the ground bleeding out. And the reason why, because Boomslag had unfortunately walked into a gang hideout. And so they shot him. Now for Steve Rogers, he's very upset, especially because these gang members, they're very young. But either way, you do have Steve Rogers beat down on these gang members and get Boomslag over to a nearby hospital. Now for Steve Rogers, he does tell us that Boomslag should most likely pull through, but while leaving the hospital, he realized that he may never figure out why in the world Boomslag was watching over Diamondback. Either way, you have Steve Rogers head back over to Avengers headquarters. Now when he does arrive, he is then confronted by a character known as Michael. Around his time in Marvel Comics, when it came to the Avengers, they had hired a bunch of people called the Avengers Support Crew. And really, it's just a bunch of people helping out the Avengers in different types of ways. But you have Michael say, hey Steve, can you do me a favor and check in on Fabian? Because Fabian has not slept in days and also acting a tad bit weird. And so once you have Steve Rogers being able to find Fabian, this begins the whole idea of streaks of poison. Because for Steve Rogers, once he does find Fabian, he realizes there's something wrong with him. Like, for example, Fabian has lost a lot of weight. Fabian is also more aggressive towards other people like Steve more than usual. But on top of that, for Fabian, it does seem like he is hallucinating as well, because there is a small moment where he believes that Steve Rogers is not the Steve Rogers that he knows. He believes somebody else pretending to be Steve Rogers. But once you have Steve being able to calm down Fabian, Steve realized the kid is on drugs. And so you have Fabian say like, yes, I'm on drugs, a new type of drug called ice. Now, we learn here that ice is technically like crack, but here's a big catch though. For ice, you only need one dose, and that one dose lasts you the entire day. But apparently, it was supposed to help Fabian stay focused, which it did, but of course, there are a lot of side effects. But you then have Steve Rogers tell Fabian, like, dude, if you're going to work here, you have to realize that the Avengers and even the support crew, we're like role models for the public. And so we have to be better than that. And so it's Steve saying, like, listen, I'm going to put you in a program, a rehab program to help you out. Now, while you have the two characters walking away, you then have Fabian wondering, how can Steve Rogers say that he is a role model when technically his powers came from a drug? And so for Steve Rogers, he's kind of like, Fabian is right. I did technically take drugs to become the man I am today. That is a huge problem. But now we pick up with two characters known as Chucky and Lowlife. Now these two characters are trying to find their partner, and that would be Tone Deaf. Now, Tone Deaf was one of those teenagers who had shot Bullseye earlier. And so you have our two characters here wondering what in the world happened at their gang hideout, because they find blood, but also the entire hideout has been locked down by the police. Now, for Lowlife, he wants to break into the hideout, but unfortunately, they are confronted by a female superhero. Now, we're not told who this hero is, but she tells them like, hey, listen, this whole entire area has been locked down. Get the heck out of here. And so you have our two guys begin to walk away. But then for Lowlife, he believes they should be able to get the jump on the female superhero, except when they turn around, she's gone. But now we have to transition back over to Steve Rogers. Now for Steve, we see him doing some research on ice. Like we do learn here that ice is kind of like speed, but more addictive than crack. You also have Steve being able to find all the different side effects as well. But for Steve, while doing his research, he begins to wonder like, you know what? What Fabian said earlier is, well, true. The whole idea of my powers came from drugs. And so now it's Steve kind of wondering if the super soldier serum was the beginning of steroids coming into America. Now for Steve, he also believes that with him being a protector of America, he should be out there tackling the drug problem across the country. But now it's time for us to get all the different characters involved, starting off with Bullseye. Now you have Bullseye currently locked up in prison. And matter of fact, he has his own special prison cell because this man, anything in his hands can be used as a weapon. Now, you do have Bullseye hit his head against the wall. Now, for security guards, they believe that maybe he has a head injury. But in reality, what Bullseye did was he knocked a tooth out, so that he can use that tooth as a weapon to take out one security guard and then grab that guard's gun to hold the other one as a hostage to allow him to escape from prison. But now we have to pick up with Steve Rogers' war on drugs. And so you have Steve pay a visit over to Fabian. And he's all like, hey, Fabian, where in the world did you get this drug from? Fabian says, I got it from a guy known as Kid Gloves. And so you have Steve wear a disguise as a way to get close to Kid Gloves. Now, once you have Steve being able to grab Kid Gloves believe that Steve is the Punisher. And so he begins to freak out because everyone knows if you're a bad guy and the Punisher finds you, then most likely you're gonna die. And so for Steve, this works perfectly. He's all like, yeah, I'm the Punisher, and you're going to tell me where you get your supplies from right now at this exact moment. And so you have Kid Gloves tell Steve Rogers like, hey, listen, I get my drugs from a guy known as Moose Meat. And so you have Steve go over to find Moose Meat and continues to pretend to be the Punisher, which of course does freak out Moose Meat as well. And so you have Moose Meat tell Steve, okay, listen, man, you can find the warehouse that has our drugs over at this location right here. And so you have Steve head over there. Now, once they do arrive, you have Kid Gloves and Moose Meat realize that Steve was never the Punisher. Instead, he was Captain America. Either way, he does go inside the warehouse. Unfortunately, you have Steve Rogers run into one of the gang members in the warehouse, and his name is Napalm. Now, there is a very good reason why he's named Napalm. And the reason why, because, well, he loves to blow things up. And just like that, the whole entire warehouse gets blown up. But as we get into the second chapter, we pick up with John Jameson. Now, John Jameson is the son to J. Jonah Jameson, but for John, he's also part of the Avengers support crew. And he was with Steve Rogers as they went over to the warehouse. Now, he didn't go inside, but right now he's seen the entire place got blown up. And so he calls in Peggy. And the reason why, because protocol says that if you are with an Avenger and they are in danger, you must call in another Avenger. And so you have Peggy call in Black Widow. Now for Peggy, she realized that there's somebody else that Steve might want to see who's not technically an Avenger, and that would be Diamondback. And so you have Peggy go ahead and call her as well. Now, this begins a love triangle between Steve Rogers, John Jameson, and also Diamondback. And you see what I mean as we go through the later chapters of this storyline. But once you have her arrive at the scene, she begins to freak out because you have John tell her like, hey, listen, the firefighters are having a hard time getting inside the building. They have no idea if there are any survivors at all. Now, for John and also Diamondback, they're kind of believing that Steve could be dead, but then Steve arrives. Now, this begins the process of us seeing Steve on drugs. Because first, you have Steve being somewhat jealous that John is holding on to Diamondback, without knowing that she believed for a brief moment there that he was dead. Now, you also have Steve kiss her as well. Now, for Steve and Diamondback, they were not officially a couple just yet. Like right now, it was more of like he likes her and she likes him. But unfortunately, neither character was able to make that move until now. And so you have her being somewhat confused, but she also believes there could be something wrong with Steve. Now, you do have Steve explain how he survived the explosion. Apparently, once he saw that napalm was going to blow the place up, he began to run away. Unfortunately, he was still caught in the blast and was sent flying into another building. But for Steve, he believes that he is perfectly okay. And so he tells John and also Diamondback, let's go ahead and head back home because I need a shower badly. But now it's time for us to check in with good old Bullseye. And you have Bullseye go over to where Wilson Fisk works out of. Now, once Bullseye arrives, he tells the Kingpin, like, listen, I want to work for you once again. I was one of your best assassins. Heck, I was probably the best assassin you had. So why not go ahead and bring me back in? Now, we also get reminded that for the Kingpin, he also has Typhoid Mary. She does not play a role in this storyline, but she is very close to the Kingpin in a very romantic kind of way. But either way, it's the Kingpin saying, fine, Bullseye, I will bring you back in. But first, you need to get some dental work done and get cleaned up, and then I will give you an assignment to help me out. But let's check in on Steve Rogers. And the reason why, because you have Steve wanting to get back out there with his war against drugs. Now, for the rest of the people around him, they're telling Steve like, okay, you want to get back out there, but we have no game plan. We have no idea where to go. But for Steve, it's more of like, don't worry about it. We'll make a plan as we get out there, but either way, let's go now and let's go find those bad guys. While that was happening, we then pick up with some random thug who's currently driving a garbage truck. And the reason why, because there are explosives on the garbage truck, and you had this guy drive the truck right into a crack house. And we're kind of wondering, why in the world would he do that for? But now we have to jump over to the Kingpin. Now, when we do, this begins the whole process of a drug war popping off in New York, because you have the Kingpin tell Bullseye, like, hey, listen, I just got word that one of my crack house just got blown up by a garbage truck. But also there was another warehouse that did not belong to me, also got blown up as well. Inside that warehouse was drugs. And so he tells Bullseye, I want you to figure out who is trying to attack me, but at the same time, I want you to figure out who is trying to move drugs into my city without my permission. And so you have Bullseye arrive at the crack house that was just recently blown up. Now, when he does arrive, we see that Black Widow is there as well. Now, for Black Widow, she's all like, hold up, I know him. Why in the world is he here? But we also see that Steve Rogers and also Diamondback are there as well, because they're kind of hoping in the possibility of the person who had blown up the crack house might come back over here again. Now, while you have the two characters waiting for Diamondback, she begins to realize that there's something off with Steve Rogers. He's a tad bit more aggressive. But unfortunately, before she is able to figure out what's going on with him, well, that is when they get word that somebody had entered the building. And so you have Steve rush into the building. But here comes a big problem. You see, you have Steve and also her use the sky cycle to get over to the building. And he quickly jumps off of it. And he never taught her how to fly that thing. And so right now it's her just trying her best not to crash into a building and possibly die. But while trying to survive, you then have her be confronted by the Black Widow. Now, the Black Widow was called in earlier because Steve had possibly died in that warehouse explosion. But now here she is wondering why in the world Diamondback is on the vehicle that belongs to Steve Rogers. And so it's Black Widow wondering, did you do something to Captain America? And so now you have these two ladies fighting against one another. But getting back over to Steve Rogers, you have Steve Rogers just walking around the building in the dark, having a hard time finding the person that had supposedly walked into the building. Now, of course, that person would be Bullseye, but Steve has no idea it is Bullseye. But you do have Steve continue to walk around. Bullseye sees Steve Rogers and realizes this is the perfect time to try to take out Steve. And so you have Bullseye being able to use a flashlight to try to blind Steve, but also throw a knife at Steve as well. And so you have Steve trying his best to use his shield to block the light, but at the same time, he has no idea a blade is heading towards him right at this exact moment. And so we're kind of left to believe the possibility now that Steve might get seriously hurt. But honestly, we already know that Steve Rogers is going to be A-OK, because as we dive into the third chapter, we pick up with Steve Rogers being able to take that sharp object into the knee, but being able to recover. And so in the early pages of the third chapter, it's really more Steve Rogers and Bullseye just trying to figure out how they're going to take out one another in the middle of this crack house in the dark. Now, we do quickly check in on Diamondback and also Black Widow. Their battle had ended up in Hudson River, where they had crashed a skycraft into it. And so you have Diamondback being able to swim back to the surface, get on a skycraft, and leave before Black Widow is able to continue the battle. Now, for Black Widow, she has no idea that technically Diamondback is a good guy, and matter of fact, working very close with Captain America. But getting back over to the battle between Bullseye and Captain America, the battle does kind of end very quickly. And the reason why, because you have Diamondback being able to get back to where Steve Rogers was at. And so for Bullseye, he knows that there's no way that he'll be able to handle two heroes at once. Now, for me personally, I feel like he still should be able to at least take out Diamondback. But either way, you have Bullseye being able to escape. Now, you do have Diamondback pick up Steve Rogers and tells him like, hey, listen, I just had a run-in with Black Widow. Now for Steve, he has no idea why Black Widow is here for, but he wants to find Bullseye. But unfortunately, Bullseye was able to hide very well from Steve and get away. And so now we pick up with some random thugs. Now you had these thugs go out of their way to find some people who are, well, selling drugs. And so out of nowhere, they do a drive-by and kill all those dealers in a matter of seconds. But we learned that was only one of the 3 drive-bys that happened last night. And so we pick up with the Kingpin. And he's very upset because all those dealers were working for him. Somebody is trying to ruin his drug operation. But now we jump back over to Steve Rogers. And when we do, we continue that trend of, hey, there's something wrong with Steve here, because we get a few more examples here. Like first, we see him being straight up rude to Peggy Carter. And the reason why? Because she had called in the Black Widow. Now, he has no idea that she called in the Black Widow because they had no idea that if he had survived that explosion earlier. But he believes that Peggy had called in the Black Widow to help out with his war against drugs. And he says, this is not an Avengers mission. This is my mission. I don't want any help at all. And so he tells Peggy, go ahead and call off the Black Widow. And he walks away. But when he does walk away, you have Steve Rogers over here, John and also Diamondback talk about him. And so he believes that they are saying horrible things about him. And so he tells John, get her the heck out of here. And so just like that, she is gone. Now for John, he begins to realize, oh yeah, there's something wrong with Steve Rogers. The question is right now, what? But then you have John want to sit down with Steve Rogers to talk about his whole idea of his war on drugs. And really, it's more of John telling Steve Rogers like, hey, dude, listen, I get it. Your war on drugs is a great idea, but here's a big problem for you. You're doing it the wrong way. You're going after the suppliers, the dealers. But honestly, you need to go after the consumers because they are the ones who are out there buying the drugs on a high demand level. And so because of that, these dealers, these suppliers, they are never going to go away at all as long there is a high demand for drugs. Now, for Steve Rogers, he tells John, I don't care what you have to say because I pay you to support me, not give me advice. And Steve just walks away. Now, it's also Diamondback kind of being very upset at how Steve treated her, but she also knows there's something wrong with him. And so we see her put on a more stealth outfit as a way to follow Steve to figure out what exactly is going on with him. Now, getting back over to Bullseye, we still have Bullseye trying to figure out who's trying to move into the Kingpin's territory. And so you have Bullseye questioning a guy saying like, hey, where did you get the ice from? I need to know right now. And so you had a guy say, listen, I got the drug from a guy known as Rizzo on 42nd and 9th. And so you have Bullseye leave to go find this Rizzo person. But now we have to pick up with Matt Murdock. Now for Matt Murdock, he had a run-in with Steve Rogers that took place over in Daredevil issue number 283. Now that issue alone took place in the middle of this issue right here. But either way, for Matt, he realized that when he was with Steve, Steve was very edgy, seemed like he was very overworked. And so it's Matt wondering, is everything okay with Steve Rogers? And speaking of Steve Rogers, Matt Murdock is right because once we do jump back over to Steve, we see him flying over Manhattan. Now, while he's doing that, he's wondering where can he go for the night to rest? And he believes that he should be able to go over to Sam Wilson's place. But now he believes in the possibility that Peggy had called Sam warning him about Steve. It kind of shows that Steve is being very paranoid. He's not acting like he usually does. Now, you do have Steve also see that there's somebody selling drugs out of a vehicle. And so you have Steve go out of his way to attack that driver to make sure he knows that he will no longer sell drugs in Steve Rogers' area. But while he was doing that, it really shows Steve Rogers being very aggressive. But either way, he did get that message across to the dealer like, hey, you're not going to sell drugs in my city at all. And Steve just walks away. But now we jump back over to Diamondback and also John Jameson. Now, this is her telling John that she believes that she knows what's going on with Steve Rogers. And she says, hey, listen, Steve was in that warehouse that got blown up earlier. In that warehouse was a huge amount of drugs. What if those drugs got into his system? But on top of that, he already has the super soldier serum. And so with the drug and the serum being combined together, it's doing a number to Steve's mind and body. That's why he's acting so differently. Now, while you have her telling John all of that, out of nowhere, those same thugs earlier who were doing drive-bys drive around the corner to do another drive-by. And they take out Diamondback and also John Jameson. But as we get into the fourth chapter, I want to do a callback to what I said earlier when it came to the love triangle between John, Captain America, and also Diamondback. Because this is the moment where you have him say like, man, you know what? She's a great woman. Because we do learn here that John is perfectly okay. And the reason why? Because Diamondback took the bullets for him. Now, luckily for her, she was wearing a bulletproof vest, but she's still somewhat injured. But you do have John say like, man, the only thing I heard about Diamondback were like she was a bad guy, a villain, but she's trying her best to be a hero. And what she did right now shows that she can be a hero. And so it's John saying like, I will never forget this. Now, for you guys, kind of like, I don't see it fresh. How in the world is this man falling in love with Diamondback? But this is only the beginning. Later on, we get more examples of like, you know what? He might get with her possibly. But now we have to jump back over to Steve Rogers. Now you have Steve Rogers find another crack house where he does look for a character known as Jerkweed. And honestly, that's a horrible name for a person. But either way, you do have Steve find Jerkweed where he's able to intimidate the guy to tell him, who is your boss? Because I want to find him and, of course, stop him. And so you have Jerkweed tell Steve, okay, listen, I'll tell you who it is. Honestly, it is Mr. Fisk. So now Steve knows to go after the Kingpin. But now we have to check in on Bullseye. And when we do, we see that Bullseye is currently undercover. Like he's pretending to be a homeless person, hoping to get close enough to somebody who's working for the other organization that's trying to move in on the Kingpin's territory. And honestly, he's in luck because those thugs earlier that were doing drive-bys, they stopped right near Bullseye. And so you have Bullseye being able to take out most of the thugs but leave one standing up, and that will be Chucky from earlier. Now, apparently Chucky is one of the managers in his whole entire operation. And so you have Bullseye say, hey, listen, I heard that you are a manager. And honestly, I don't care for you. I want to know who pays you to be the manager. So I got this gun right now pointing to your head, and I'm telling you right now, you better give me all the information I want to hear. And so now you have Steve Rogers go pay a visit over to the Kingpin. Now, when he does, it's Steve saying like, dude, I know that what's happening right now in the city is because of you. Because right now somebody is trying to attack your whole entire drug operation, which is leading into a all-out drug war in Manhattan. And so I want to know if you know who's trying to move in on your territory. Now, for the Kingpin, he's playing it safe here, pretending that he has no idea what's happening in the city. He's pretending that he's not involved with all the drugs being sold right now in Manhattan. But he's also telling Steve the honest truth here by saying, dude, I have no idea who's trying to move in on the city. If I did know, I would tell you. Now, at the same time, if you were able to stop this person from moving in on, you say, my territory, to tell you right now, I will be in your debt. And so for Steve, he leaves, but unfortunately, he has no idea who's trying to move in on the Kingpin's territory. But right after Steve leaves, he's then confronted by Daredevil, who wants to check in on Steve. Now, we do a small quick check-in on Diamondback. We do see that she is okay. Now, John is there to take care of her, but this kind of continues the whole idea of the possibility of these two characters getting together. But getting over to Bullseye for a brief moment, we see Bullseye still doing his job to figure out who's trying to move in on the territory of Wilson Fisk. And so he found somebody else who's higher than Chucky was, and so now he's hoping to get to the actual leader of the other operation. But now I want to go ahead and get into the ending for today's video, where we now pick up with Steve Rogers fighting against Daredevil. And the reason why, because he believes that Matt came there because the Avengers had told Matt to check in on Steve. But in reality, it's just Matt being there, being a good friend. Because again, they met up on a previous night. And back then to Matt, he realized there was something wrong with Steve. But Steve is just being too paranoid, but at the same time, more aggressive than usual. And so right now, we're seeing Steve as somebody, if no one agrees with him, he is going to attack them. And so you now have Steve attacking Matt Murdock, full strength. And so Matt is trying his best to play defense, but at the same time, not trying to attack Steve, because he realized there is something wrong with his friend. Either way, the fight ends with Steve Rogers beating down on Matt Murdock and leaving Matt there on the ground, just knocked out. But we also see somebody saw the fight, and that would be Crossbones. But this is where... What's going on there, YouTube? Welcome back to another comic book video. All right, so we are going to continue our coverage over Captain America Streets of Poison. Now, this was a 7-part story arc that came out in the early 1990s. Now, we are already covered the first 4 chapters of this storyline, and so today's video, we're going to cover the last 3 chapters of Streets of Poison. But here is a quick reminder of what's going on so far when it comes to this storyline. So, starting off with Steve Rogers, you see, for Steve Rogers, he is currently on a mission right now to put an end to a new drug out there called ice. And let me explain why. You see, for Steve Rogers, in our last video, he had found out that a character known as Fabian, who works for the Avengers support crew, was unfortunately on drugs, a brand new drug called ice. And so for Steve Rogers, his main goal was to shut down the entire operation. The problem is for Steve Rogers is that once he found a warehouse that had a huge supply of the brand new drug called ice, well, the whole entire warehouse was blown up. And so the ice drug was able to get into the bloodstream of Steve Rogers. And here comes the big problem. You see, with the brand new drug of ice, but also his super soldier serum, it is a bad mix. And so right now you have Steve Rogers being more aggressive than usual, but also becoming very paranoid. And so right now is Steve kind of going against everybody who's just trying to help him out. Like, for example, Daredevil. You see, for Matt Murdock, he ran to Steve Rogers one night and realized there was something wrong with Steve Rogers. And so he had decided to go out of his way to see if Steve was okay. But for Steve, he was so paranoid. And so he believed that Matt was sent there by the Avengers to help support Steve Rogers or to possibly stop him. But in reality, it was just Matt being like a good friend, wanting to make sure that his friend was okay. Either way, you have Steve begin to beat down on Matt Murdock at the very end of our last video. And matter of fact, with that battle ending, it leads into the opening pages for this video right here. You see, after you have Steve Rogers being able to beat the living you-know-what out of Matt Murdock and walk away, you had Crossbones arrive. Now, this is the first time that Crossbones or Matt Murdock is meeting one another. And the reason why I'm saying that, because to Crossbones, he's kind of like, Who in the world is this guy right now in a devil suit just knocked out? Now, Matt Murdock, he is pretending to be knocked out. And the only reason why, because his body is badly hurting right now, thanks to Steve Rogers giving him that beat down earlier. And so he knows that he cannot fight against Crossbones at the moment. And so right now, it's just Matt pretending to be knocked out. Now, for Crossbones, he's kind of like, listen, I have a mission to complete, but at the same time, I want to know who you are under that mask. And so you have Crossbones lift up the mask to see Matt Murdock's secret identity. Now, for Crossbones, he has no idea who Matt Murdock is, but he now knows what he looks like. And so you have Crossbones walk away to go complete his supposed mission. And so we kind of find out that Crossbones, his mission right now is to go after the Kingpin. Now, in our last video, we had learned that there is a drug war happening in Manhattan. Now, we already know we have a new drug out there called ice, but we have no idea who's right now trying to create and push that drug in Manhattan. But the Kingpin, he's also trying to sell drugs in Manhattan, but it's not ice that he is selling. And so, of course, we have a drug war. And so for Crossbones, his boss said, hey, I need you to go after the Kingpin. The problem is Crossbones had no idea that the Kingpin had somebody to watch over him, and that would be Typhoid Mary. Now, Typhoid Mary is not really able to take down Crossbones, but luckily for her and also the Kingpin, Daredevil arrives. Now, when he does arrive, it is hilarious because for Kingpin, he's kind of like Matt Murdock, Daredevil, my worst enemy, is now here trying to protect me. What in the world is going on here? But for the Kingpin, this is the perfect time to try to escape. And so he does, while you have Matt try to fight against, well, Crossbones. But now we jump over to Steve Rogers, and when we do, we're getting a good look of how bad things have come for Steve Rogers while being on ice. Because now it's Steve Rogers saying like, okay, you know what? I'm now becoming more paranoid. I'm now hearing voices inside my head. Those voices are people I've met over the years who are now telling me that I am not even a good Captain America. And that is a huge problem. Now, Steve knows that he needs to rest, but the problem is the ice drug in his system is telling him to keep pushing on. And so he's trying to push on. But now we have to jump over to Diamondback. Now, in Marvel Comics, originally, Diamondback was a bad guy. But then, by this point in Marvel's timeline, she was a good guy. Matter of fact, she was a love interest for Steve Rogers. You know what? Even on top of that, she's also part of a love triangle with her, Steve Rogers, and also John Jameson. Now, these two characters, they're trying to work together to hopefully find Steve Rogers, but then they are confronted by the Black Widow. Now, for the Black Widow, in our last video, she had no idea that Diamondback is a good guy, and so she had attacked her believing that she did something to Steve Rogers, not knowing that she is now a good guy. And so you have Black Widow apologize, but now want to help them to find Steve Rogers before things get a whole lot worse. But getting back over to Crossbones, you have Crossbones being able to take down Daredevil very easily. But once you have Crossbones do that, he realized that the Kingpin got away. Now, when he goes back into the office of the Kingpin, he also realized that Matt Murdock also got away as well. And so for Crossbones, this mission is a complete failure. And so now he's afraid to call up his boss. Now, for Matt Murdock, he's going to go ahead and leave the book for the time being because homeboy needs his rest. He got his butt kicked twice in one night. Steve Rogers and also Crossbones. But for the Kingpin, he wants to know who in the world is trying to go to war with him when it comes to drug in his city. And so the Kingpin, he believes that sooner or later Bullseye should be able to get that information for him. Now, we do learn who Crossbones is working for, which honestly, there's no big surprise here. It's the Red Skull. He's the other person on the other side of this drug war at the moment. He's the one who's currently pushing ice into Manhattan. But getting back over to our heroes, Diamondback, John Jameson, and also Black Widow, they do find Steve Rogers. But here comes the big problem. Steve Rogers does not believe he is on drugs. They're telling him like, dude, you're on drugs right now and we're here to help you. But the problem is the ice drug in his system is making him more aggressive, making him more paranoid than usual, because now he believes that the heroes are against him. He believes that they're there to stop him. And so you have Steve just being that aggressive hero, trying to beat down on them. Now, after a few pages, you do have Black Widow find a way to get close enough to Steve Rogers to knock him out, to finally take him back home. But as we jump back over to Crossbones, you have Crossbones telling Red Skull everything that happened when it came to his attempt to assassinate the Kingpin. But while you have the two characters talking, they have no idea that outside the building is Bullseye, who's working for the Kingpin, who's right now trying to get ready to kill off the Red Skull. And so as we jump into the second chapter, it's really more of us now picking up with Bullseye just being able to break into the room where the Red Skull is at and shoot the Red Skull right in the head. And so now we're kind of left to believe that the Red Skull is now officially dead. And so you have Crossbones trying his best to fight against Bullseye. Now, after a while, you do have Bullseye being able to get away from Crossbones. But now it seems like the Red Skull is dead, but not really. You see, you have Crossbones find out that the Red Skull is not dead. That matter of fact, it was a robot that was pretending to be the Red Skull. Now for Crossbones, he does feel somewhat bad because he did technically let his boss get shot in the head. But at the same time, it's kind of like, well, I don't feel that bad because it was a robot that got shot in the head. But for Bullseye, he believes that he had officially killed off the Red Skull. But as we check in on Steve Rogers, you have our heroes wondering if Steve is going to be okay. Now, for the doctor there, he tells them like he doesn't know. Because honestly, when it comes to Steve's blood sample, it's very unique. With the combination of the super soldier serum, but also the ice drug as well, it's a whole new type of game for the doctor. He says, listen, we now must wait for Henry Pym to show up because only Henry can possibly figure out how to help out Steve Rogers. Now, you also have the Black Widow leave the book, but before she does tell Diamondback, like, hey, listen, I see great things for you coming down the road, and I'm hoping that you and I can work together again down the road as a team, but also hoping I can show you some of my moves as well. And there goes the Black Widow. She leaves the book. But you didn't have Bullseye call up the Kingpin and say, hey, boss, listen, I was able to take out the Red Skull. He is good as dead. Now, for Bullseye, he thinks like everything is A-okay. And matter of fact, you have the Kingpin say, cool, I'm going to pay you. But the Kingpin knows there's no way that the Red Skull is dead that easily. It's the Kingpin saying, nah, sooner or later, we might have another run-in with the Red Skull down the road. And honestly, the Kingpin is right because we do see the Red Skull is alive and well. Now, the Red Skull, he knows there's somebody in his organization that is actually working for the Kingpin, but at the same time, he has somebody in the Kingpin's group as well. But either way, it's the Red Skull now heading over to Manhattan. But now we have to jump back over to Steve Rogers. Now, when we do, it's Steve Rogers once again hallucinating, except this time it's a pretty harsh round of hallucinations because you now have Steve Rogers being confronted by Dr. Erskine when it comes to his hallucinations. Now, the doctor is basically telling him that the super soldier serum is a drug. And so for Steve Rogers, he can't believe that he's out there trying to have a war on drugs, but in reality, his powers came from a drug. Now, once you have Steve Rogers being able to overcome these hallucinations, you have the rest of his friends walk into the room, including Hank Pym. And it's Steve Rogers saying like, Hank, I need help. It's the drugs. is doing a number to me. I am constantly hallucinating. Please help me out. Now, we do get a couple of pages where it's really the Red Skull trying to figure out who in his camp is actually a spy for the Kingpin. But at the same time, he's also wanting to set up a meeting with the Kingpin as well to hopefully work out some kind of deal. And so you have the Red Skull tell Crossbones, hey, I need you to get in contact with the Kingpin instantly. But as we jump back over to Hank Pym, is Hank Pym now telling us, the readers, that the only way to help out Steve Rogers is to give him a blood transfusion. But here comes the big problem with that, though, because if Hank Pym does pull out the blood of Steve Rogers, he's also pulling out the super soldier serum, which means that Steve Rogers will no longer be Captain America. Now, for Hank, he's really hoping here that once they go through the blood transfusion, if he's able to clean the blood, meaning that get rid of the ice that's in the blood, he should be able to give Steve his blood back to allow Steve to be, once again, Captain America. But the problem is, it's a huge if. We don't know if this game plan is truly going to work out. But as we jump back over to the Kingpin, we see the Kingpin right now at the Yankee Stadium. And the reason why, because it's going to be the meeting spot for him and the Red Skull. By the way, we also going to find out the Yankees lose to the Red Sox 26-2, which honestly is pretty wild to see. But either way, the two bad guys are now going to meet up very soon. But now we have to jump over to Steve Rogers. Now, when we do, it's really more of Steve Rogers kind of wondering, like, can he still be Captain America without the super soldier serum? But either way, he does leave the base of the Avengers. And the reason why, because he has something to prove that he can still be Captain America. And so he just walks out. Now, he is confronted by Peggy Carter, who's right now begging him to not leave. But again, he has to prove something. He has to prove no matter what, he'll still be Captain America. And so he walks out. But for the second chapter, it does close the Kingpin meeting up with the Red Skull. And the question is right now, how will this meeting truly go? But you also have Steve Rogers continue on trying to prove that he can still be Captain America. But as we jump into the third and final chapter for today's video, we pick up with the Red Skull and the Kingpin's meeting. Now, the Red Skull and the Kingpin, they have never truly gotten along. I mean, like, guys, the Red Skull and the Kingpin, they truly do hate each other a lot. And matter of fact, we kind of saw that back in Acts of Vengeance crossover. But for the Red Skull, it's him telling the Kingpin right now, hey man, listen, I don't plan on leaving here. I don't plan on basically telling you that I will go ahead and stop my entire operation when it comes to me selling ice. I plan on continuing to push ice into your territory. Now, for the Kingpin, also the Red Skull, they agreed to fight against each other in a one-on-one battle. If the Red Skull wins, then the Kingpin must not stop the Red Skull at all when it comes to him pushing ice in the Kingpin territory. But if the Kingpin wins, then the Red Skull must sell his ice operation over to the Kingpin. Now, for me personally, it kind of seems like the Red Skull going to win either way here. But either way, you do have the Kingpin agree to have this one-on-one battle with the Red Skull. Now, for Steve Rogers, he's kind of wondering why in the world is the stadium light still on still at Yankee Stadium? It's 2 o'clock in the morning. And so that is how he's able to find out about the Red Skull and the Kingpin fighting against one another. And so now we have to jump over to their battle. Now, when it comes to the battle between the Red Skull and also the Kingpin, we can say here that both characters are evenly matched for one another. And let me explain. You see, for the Red Skull, he may have speed on his side, but the Kingpin is very durable. But then for the Kingpin, he may be stronger than the Red Skull, but the Red Skull moves too fast for the Kingpin to easily hit. Both characters are evenly matched for one another, but either way, the battle does continue on. Now, for a brief moment, we go back over to the base of the Avengers, and the reason why, because you have Diamondback realize that Steve Rogers is gone, and so she tells John and also Hank, like, hey guys, he's gone, Cap left, and we gotta find him right now. But as we jump back over to Steve Rogers, you have Steve Rogers arrive at Yankee Stadium. Now, Crossbones saw Steve Rogers land, and so you have those two characters battling against one another. But here's the thing. You see, for Steve Rogers, while he fights against Crossbone, you have the Red Skull and the Kingpin continue on with their battle. Now, I kind of want to focus more on the Steve Rogers battle. And here's the reason why. Because for Steve Rogers, he's no longer a super soldier. The serum is gone from his body. And so it's him right now just trying his best to fight against Crossbone. Now, luckily for Steve, by the time we do get to the very end of this storyline, you do have Steve being able to defeat Crossbones, but just barely. Now, down below, you have the Kingpin also being able to take care of the Red Skull. So those two characters are the winners. Now, by the time you have Steve Rogers being able to get over to the Red Skull and also the Kingpin, the battle is over. But you have the Kingpin tell Steve Rogers that he was the one who was able to stop the Red Skull. That the Red Skull, for some strange, crazy reason, wanted to battle against the Kingpin. But the Kingpin took that battle on and he won and he saved the city. And so right now, Manhattan is in his debt. Now, for Steve Rogers, he's kind of like, you know what? Whatever. I am done with this mess. I'm going to go ahead and walk away. But technically, this is the ending for Streets of Poison. And so this is where we're going to end today's comic book video. So please leave me a like down below and subscribe. But guys, see y'all next comic book video.